Thank you, Director Kim, for your wonderful remarks, and it's incredibly nice to see so many friends in the audience. I feel like this is a local audience almost for me. And thank you, Gina Lee, the exhibition's curator. What a marvellous exhibition, for inviting me to talk here this afternoon. Just after I sent my lecture title to Gina, and it's always frustrating that you have to send the title and the abstract before you actually think about what you're going to say, I realised that I'd used the title before, not once, but actually twice. Firstly, for the lecture I gave in Moscow, before the war in 2015, but also for my written introduction to Tate Modern's Bourgeois retrospective, which I curated in London in 2007. So please forgive me for repetition, but I assure you this lecture itself includes a bit of new, a bit of rethinking. But there is something meaningful in that repetition. After all, this title itself refers to the way in which Louise Bourgeois, as an artist, returned again and again in her work over many decades to the same themes, the same motifs and stories, but also the way in which we, as you, the audience, those of us who are curators and critics and art historians, we revisit artists. We're never done with them. We rethink our earlier views. We reflect. We need to find new readings in the work. And over a lifetime, an artist's work evolves, but so does, simultaneously, and sometimes in sync, sometimes out of sync, so does the context in which the work is made and understood. And I think this is especially true for Louise Bourgeois. A work that she made in the 1940s becomes something completely different when met with in the 1980s, or subject, re-examined in 2000, is interrogated in a completely different world to the world that nurtured the emergence of the work, maybe 60 years before that. So much, although much of the interpretation of Louise Bourgeois' work is focused on her own life history, and few artists have been focused so much in terms of the biography. But like the best and most powerful art, it seems even now, 15 years after her death, it seems to draw us in, allowing us into her own poetic and personal life and those associations, and for us to connect to a lived and deeply felt experience. So I first met Louise as a young curator, as working at Tate in the early 1990s. And it was shortly after she had just represented the USA at the Venice Biennial in 1993. She was sort of a star. And interestingly, it was the same biennial that also profiled Yayoi Kusama as a senior but emerging star. And I visited Louise in her New York studio to talk to her, record an interview about a work that had been in Venice and that Tate was about to acquire. It was one of the cell pieces that were really profiled for the first time at that show. But I was also there to invite her to participate in a survey show of international contemporary art that I was curating at Tate Gallery, working with a journalist and art critic at that time. It was called Rites of Passage, Art for the End of the Century. And that's a copy of the catalogue cover. And it was an exhibition that set out to explore the way in which a kind of new generation, mostly younger artists, some very young, artists were engaging with the transition, the transformation, and liminality, the kind of in-between stages of life, both physical and spiritual, birth, puberty, and death at the end of the 20th century. It was a kind of end-of-the-century show. An exhibition made in the shadow of the AIDS crisis, of growing perceptions of ecological loss and mounting geopolitical fragmentation in the post-communist era. And we had chosen 11 international artists, including Miroslav Balka, Mona Hatoum, Bill Viola, and Robert Gober, most of them decades younger than Louise Bourgeois. I was therefore particularly anxious about this first meeting. Louise was by then the grande dame of the New York avant-garde art world. Her weekly salons were legendary affairs. Artists, critics, and curators would come and pay court to her, sitting in trepidation, waiting to be cut down to size by her unhesitating and devilishly sharp criticism. I was unnerved from the start. She presented as a tiny, sharp-eyed old lady, sitting at a work table, surrounded by the chaos of a long life, lived through art, posters, books, photo albums, and rows of cassettes, evidence of dozens of past interviews. Her assistant turned on the tape recorder for me. It wasn't a comfortable conversation. Most of my questions were met with no, some with no, no, and one or two with no, 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 no. Midway through the interview, Louise Bourgeois got up and walked out of the room. Without explanation, I was left alone, not knowing what to do. Pack up and leave? Not an option. But it was a moment of time stilled. I still don't know where she went, nor why, but after a while she did reappear, and we ploughed on. On my return, I could not face listening to the recording. I put the cassette in the back of a drawer, and I didn't listen to it for over 15 years. In fact, almost 20 years. By the time Louise died in 2010, aged 99, I knew her much better. This is the picture for knowing her much better. It's the last photograph that was taken of us together in her studio. And I like the way that we're kind of wearing very similar outfits. I think they're both tops by Agnes B. And I think that's one thing that we did agree on, what to wear. And I found it hard to believe that there would be no more visits, no more moments of disabling panic and awe at her wisdom and intelligence. Her assistant, Jerry Gorovoy, who by then was a much-loved friend, asked me to speak at her memorial in New York. Of course, another daunting challenge, but one I felt privileged to take on. And I dug out that old interview, and I listened with some trepidation. But of course, 20 years later, it sounded quite brilliant. She'd given off her absolute best. When she described herself proudly as a guerrilla fighter, her multiple no's sounded like blasts of shellfire from a sniper. And despite her years, she was then well into her 9th decade. She presented as a lone female innovator hacking through the undergrowth of the art world's, New York's macho urban art world jungle. So Louise Bourgeois was represented in Rites of Passage in London by a selection of those recent cell works, including the Red Rooms, part of which is here in this show. And the cells represent a moment when Louise Bourgeois took a kind of stride forward in her work. It was a real kind of paradigm shift in scale and ambition, an I do moment. And these were originally two works, two chambers, circular chambers. And they're wonderful enclosures made from wooden doors salvaged from a courthouse in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, where she had her studio. And I think they focus, like much of her work by that stage, on the parent-child relationship. And placed inside these enclosures were strange, pendulous hanging forms, exquisite objects carved in marble and blown in glass, delicately embroidered fabric, and carefully selected found objects, collections kind of brought together to manipulate and shape the viewer's experience. And when I first saw the Red Room parents here last week, I was reminded of the way Bourgeois both frustrates and rewards the viewer, a little bit like she frustrated, but then rewarded me in my interview. And the enclosure here is not easy to get into. In fact, you are denied entry. You have to peep through the cracks and look then round the corners. And it may be her story, as Bourgeois always claimed, but exploring a work like this of Louise Bourgeois becomes a very personal experience. We're seduced into the work by association. I mean, here, the red of the title is surely an evocation of danger, while the mirror that you see from one side of the Red Room parent literally draws you into her world, your image into that work. And the je t'aime, the I love you that you just see on that little pillow on the bed, of course, is something that we have all experienced. But if we haven't experienced, we've all longed for. It was shortly after that exhibition, Rites of Passage, that we invited Louise Bourgeois to make a work for the opening of Tate Modern, which was opening in 2000, and I was one of a small group of curators charged with filling the building with art, both the collection, but also the opening commission. And this was to be the first in a series of annual commissions that continues to this day. There were, of course, a lot of contenders. Richard Serra's name was on everyone's lips as the obvious choice. His vast steel pieces at the Guggenheim Bilbao were obviously a masterpiece. But we wanted to work with an artist who would stretch themselves, who had the ability and the ambition and risk-taking facility to do something unprecedented. And we felt that Louise Bourgeois, despite her age, maybe because of her age, had the ambition and determination to take on that challenge. She was also, of course, a woman. And we wanted to make a statement when we opened to Tate Modern that here was an artist who would rebalance the approach to gender in contemporary art. She was the oldest of young artists, as I put it then. Perhaps now I would say the youngest of old, with strong connections to other artists at key points across almost the entirety of the 20th century. And Tate Modern was a museum of contemporary art, but with a history that went back to 1900. So, of course, Louise, who was born in 1911 in Paris, came of age alongside Surrealism, and she remained in touch with many of the French Surrealists, especially with Marcel Duchamp, over many years. Joan Miro was a childhood encounter, later a great friend in New York. Then, after the war in New York, she sparred with the older generation of abstract expressionists after the war. She parted with the rising stars of pop artists in the 1960s, and then more recently with younger artists like Jenny Holzer and Ronnie Horn, both on display at Liam right now in town. They were finding in Louise Bourgeois an ally in the still very male atmosphere of the Manhattan art world. Tracy and Emin in London followed suit as a friend. So the commission itself, after the invitation, nothing, silence. Louise walked out of the room. A few months later, we received a first proposal in the post, a large transparency, no letter, no title, an image of a single vertiginous tower. At the top of a tall spiral staircase that wound around a tower was a railed platform capped by vast circular mirrors, a single chair, a place from which to view and on which to be viewed. Inside the tower was a little doorway and a small chamber. We were thrilled. Then 2 weeks later, another transparency arrived in the post. Very similar, but somehow different. This one had a more substantial and tighter spiral. It had a secondary chamber or room inside and an internal spiral staircase, allowing for this time a continuous flow of visitors. And here the platform included 2 chairs. And then finally, a couple of weeks later, a third image came of a brutally enclosed square, and this a tower, a square tower, this accompanied by a title for the work confirming, thankfully, that this was a group, not alternatives. The title, I do, I undo, I redo. And according to Bourgeois herself, the work for Tate Modern, and that's a picture of it finally installed, really almost in the opening week of Tate Modern, the title refers specifically, as she said, to mother-child relationships. Each tower incorporated a small sculpture of a mother and child, the good mother, the bad mother, and the kind of it's going to be all right mother. And 2 of those little sculptures are in this exhibition here on display. In talking with me, when I went to visit her a year before we opened, Bourgeois was very insistent and precise about the meaning of the work. This, she said, was a family affair, each work indicating a different kind of relationship. I do, an active state. I am in control. There is no fear. It is the I love you. The undo is the unraveling. It is the return of the repressed. I am the bad mother. The redo means that a solution is found to the problem. You have confidence again. There is hope and love. Very precise, very specific, very personal. But so much of Louise Bourgeois' symbolism, I would argue, it simply cannot be constrained by that single reading. The spiral forms in these works cannot but evoke stories of growth, of evolution, and the life cycle that go back to ancient times and connect to mythologies of birth and regeneration. The passage up and down of the visitor seemed also to symbolize the ebb and flow of relationships, successive states of intimacy, alienation, and reconciliation that we all negotiate through life. So Bourgeois used her own personal experience of the maternal relationship. She was, after all, both daughter and mother herself, as a powerful way to bridge the personal and the universal, and to enable both psychic and phenomenological experiences of forms in space and over time, allowing them to unfold as an exploration of personal memory, hers and ours. And of course, over time, during its life, her life, and in her afterlife, the work has accrued a polyphony of additional meanings. Louise's working process, as we know now, is so often a return. This exhibition here at home is an exhibition full of works that stand on the shoulders of other works, not as repeats, but as revisitations, reinventions. In fact, we could see the pattern of the artist's whole career in this way. She came to prominence in the late 1940s, she unraveled in the 1950s and 60s, and returned triumphantly from the 1980s. So the physical and the psychological, the personal and the public, profoundly enmeshed in these powerful works. And content is inseparable from form, but content cannot determine its outcome, its shape, its materiality, its look, and the physical experience of the work. And all of these, I would argue, are crucial to our intellectual and emotional engagement. So the spiral staircases are real and quite challenging pathways. You walk up them, you're breathless at the top. You come down carefully. They're metaphors. In climbing them, the visitor experiences darkness and exposure to precarious heights, prompting feelings of claustrophobia, vertigo, agoraphobia, all of which the artist had herself felt during her frequent periods of depression. And on the top, the observation platforms act as spaces for contemplation, for sure, but also for confrontation as we meet ourselves, our companions, and even strangers in space or in the enormous mirrors that return and distort our images. So here in these complex, monumental three-part works was clear evidence of an artist at the height of her powers, pushing herself in scale and ambition, but also working with the audience in really interesting new ways. During the course of an early conversation with the artist and Jerry about the evolution of the towers, I came across, or shown, I can't remember which, a very early painting of Louise's from 1946, which I had not seen before. And it was of, actually that's one of the little sculptures in the bottom of the I Do tower, and I referenced that two of those little sculptures are in this show. This is the painting that I saw at that time. Three figures on top of a tower, figures teetering on the precipice, and this face with a huge screaming mouth and a head resembling Louise herself in the swathes of dark hair tossing like a horse's mane in the wind. It's not very difficult to read it as a self-portrait of a mother of three in extreme distress. And the towers also connect her drawings, prints, and paintings she made in the 1940s, when newly arrived in America from France. Louise was bringing up three small children, two by birth, one adopted, and finding her feet as an artist. Her diaries from this period detail the very rich cultural life, the close relationships she maintained and grew with the upper echelons of New York's fascinating cultural world, and her interactions with a group of émigré artists, all of whom were seeking refuge from a Europe ravaged by war and its aftermath. And Louise was desperately homesick for France. She loved her husband, but she had her affairs and fantasies. She was fiercely loyal and fiercely jealous, racked by anxiety, driven by ambition, and intensely curious about the world, the external world, the present, the past, and the inner world, the life of the mind and the psyche. And the self is such a strong presence in her very earliest paintings. Included here in this exhibition is a wonderful painting. It's the grey painting on the screen now, towards the right. It's recognisably a depiction of the house the family lived in on East 18th Street in Manhattan, which is called Stuyvesant's Folly, of the family home. And she depicts a house with arms, 3 arms, again that magic number 3, and legs. It's one of 4 woman houses that she made. One is a courthouse, the one kind of to the left of Stuyvesant's Folly. Then the painting on the far left here, or right, your left, my right, I can't work it out, this one here, is a depiction of the family's weekend cottage at Easton in Connecticut. And on the far side, in the monochromatic painting, is a depiction of the family house at Choisy-le-Roi in France, south of Paris, a house where she was brought up. These women houses, of course, are self-portraits. Louise as housewife, a woman trapped, submerged in domesticity. Marie-Laure Bernadac, Bourgeois' biographer, usefully points towards the philosopher-writer Gaston Bachelard for a deeper understanding of the paintings as explorations of the mind-body or body and soul, spaces of imprisonment and claustrophobia. But I would also suggest that we look beyond the kind of erudite to the wider world of popular culture and think about post-war suburban America's relentless association of the female housewife with the homemaker. Open any magazine from the 1940s and look at the advertising. And this, I think, was a taproot of the good mother, bad mother binary that Louise Bourgeois explored over many decades. So these images of the female body trapped in a building recur over the years in countless formulations and materials, from marble, wonderful marble work from 1983, to terry toweling, and even most memorably, in my view, to this Barbie doll. This, do you see here? This is just from a shelf in her studio in Brooklyn, a little plastic popular teenage doll, which she's taken clay and built up a little house around that figure. It was a maquette that she wanted to have made in marble, but it was just too delicate to ever be realized, but she kept it, and it remains one of those curios in her collection. All of these and many more are reworkings of the theme rather than repeats. Here's a work from 1994, for example, by which time she was working in fabric, and where a house is grounded. It feels like it's come from outer space and landed on a female torso, as if the torso is a landscape. And the meanings are different, more ambiguous. Is the house a burden, or is the house kind of growing a richly generative outcome of the family, of nurtured by femininity? In those early years, Louise had a studio at Stuyvesant's Folly, for her first studio, with access to the rooftop, from where she could observe the drama of New York's soaring, ever-growing skyline. And there's a wonderful suite of etchings in this exhibition, she made in 1947, called He Disappeared into Complete Silence. There are just two of them that I'm showing you here. And they seem to me to speak directly to this lofty urban landscape and the kind of existential isolation that Bourgeois would have experienced herself and witnessed in others, émigrés to a foreign city. Each etching is accompanied by a short text, and this is one of the first indications that Bourgeois was not just a visual artist, but she was a writer. And these little stories are sad, absurdist, tales of loneliness, family, and violence. And as Louise Bourgeois later explained, they represent a human condition. The buildings do not touch. Louise's comment, I think, about touch is so interesting and revealing, because it was not long after these foundational images, paintings and prints, that she began to make sculpture, which of course involved touch directly, and which then touch us in turn in very different ways. The effect is different to the affect of painting. She was by then working on the rooftop of her home, and using for the most part cedarwood planks discarded from the ubiquitous water towers that marked Manhattan's rooftops in those days. You see on the left, this image here, she's on the rooftop with her sculptures looking jolly happy. And on the right-hand side, you can see that she took her sculptures away for the weekends. They were almost like people to her. There's a sort of almost personal and emotional relationship between these figures and the artist herself. They were vertical, they were totemic, chiseled, jointed. Some had limbs, others carried shopping bags. And when 17 of them were shown at the first time in an exhibition in 1949 at Gallery Peridot, she placed them very carefully in a theatrical and very highly charged setting, close but not touching. And with that very strong vertical presence, the association of these figures is as much with architecture as it is with the body, with presence and loss. And as the series evolved, she made several with clear references to columns or pillars, and others connected to facades and doorways. So that conversation between the body and architecture continues through this body of work. Over time, she made figures by stacking units and others that spiral around a central core. So this is also the moment when the spiral emerges. And here's an image of them grouped in the downstairs room of the house the family then moved into in 1962 on West 20th Street in Chelsea. And you just see the sheer number of these works and their density, how intense her production was, obsessive. Really, that obsession and inability not to work really marks her practice from very early on. She called these works personnages, and she said of them that they represented people she missed. They were presences, they occupied the whole room. They represented the people I had left behind. She means in France. That is to say, my father, my mother, my brother, my whole family, and my cousins, all the people I left behind in France. I'd come to this country alone. It was a kind of memorial. And this is really dark, dark stuff. But I've also long reflected not on just the emotion and the personal association, but the formal origins of these works. Their importance to Louise is reflected surely in the fact that decades later, in extreme old age, she returned to make them again in fabric. And there's a really beautiful island display in this exhibition where you see some of the early works paired with her late fabric pillars, her personnage. But Louise belonged to a generation that was simply not comfortable with divulging influences. For the surrealist generation, the unconscious was the source. Abstract expressionists worked with automatism and inspiration. Rothko and Newman talked of making paintings as a near-religious experience. So I can see now in retrospect how when I interviewed Louise back in the 1990s, how she scorned my interest in influence. Whenever I suggested a source, she would respond, absolutely not. But of course now, in retrospect, I think it is possible to see these works in the context of their time. Giacometti, Barnett Newman, David Smith, they were all involved in reconstructing the human figure in ways that speak to bourgeois. And their work was highly visible in the New York of the 1940s. And they, in turn, like Brancusi and Picasso, were all looking outside Europe for exemplars in other cultures. And we know now, what I didn't know then, was that Louise, alongside the literature of the psyche, was fascinated by anthropology. She was an avid reader of key anthropologists like Claude Lévi-Strauss or Margaret Mead, and fascinated, and we know this from her diaries, by Mexican art and votive offerings. Her husband's, Robert Goldwater's, landmark study of primitive and modern art was published a decade earlier. The house must have been overflowing with images of primitive art. I know that Louise loathed or disliked extremely the kind of faux, or what she would call fake primitivism of artists like Dubuffet, but we know now through her diaries that she and her husband absolutely shared a fascination with African art, and in particular African masks. And she was later to admit in an interview with a journalist, never published, but in an archive, that the use of nails in some of her personnages, not one in this exhibition, but visible in archive photographs, derived from the Nkisi Nkonda power figures created by the Congo figures, people in Central America, which Louise said she had seen on display at the Brooklyn Museum. And I wonder whether deep research in the afterlife of Louise Bourgeois will not reveal other sources as well. As the figures evolved from the tapered single columns to the stacks and spirals that you can see in this image, other associations suggest themselves, including, for example, the Motoko or Langoa figural post from the Congo, which Louise would surely have seen in French ethnographic collections as a young woman or encountered through her husband's research. I think this is such an interesting parallel. Of course, one of the tasks of an art historian or curator is to make sense of that artist's context, to sift through the soil that nourished the work and its development, its movement towards the artist's signature style. One big challenge that faced us, and me in particular as curator, when we started working on the major retrospective of her career for Tate Modern in 2007, was then to understand a very abrupt gap in her work from the end of the 1940s to the beginning of the 1960s. Maybe we call it her sculptural undoing. The first work her doing, then there was a moment of undoing, a decade in which she produced no work, before she then emerged in a new guise. It felt as if Louise Bourgeois had put down the hammer and chisel on the workbench in 1953 and returned to the studio 10 years later, but this time with a bucket, a wet plaster, and latex. I was aware that during those years there were diversions. She opened an antiquarian bookshop, she did some teaching, she moved house, and there were hints always of a breakdown. And there is one essay by Mignon Nixon in our catalogue that looked at the whole aspect of the association between her work and her mental condition, the beginnings of an understanding of the psychoanalytic approach. But it was only later, really after her death, that papers then were uncovered that revealed a long history of really deep depression and a breakdown, serious breakdown, following the death of her father, Louis, in 1951. And the following year, Louise began to visit, almost on a daily basis for the first few months, a brilliant German Jewish analyst called Dr. Lowenthal. She saw him frequently during the early years, and then intermittently until his death in 1985. And Bourgeois made extraordinarily detailed notes after these sessions. She kept detailed records of her dreams, always, and these psychoanalytic writings are fascinating and constitute an incredibly rich body of work. They're also a very important body of work to anybody interested in psychoanalysis, because the testimony of psychoanalysis by patients is incredibly rare. And the testimony of psychoanalysis by artists who happen to be extraordinarily gifted artists is even rarer. So it's a unique body of work that exists in parallel, I think, to her sculptural work, and shouldn't always be muddled into one, corralled into the same area. But after a decade of this very intense psychoanalysis, and from this dark, subterranean studio that Bourgeois had, no longer on the rooftop, she's now in the basement, came works in which that taut verticality that you see in the upright figures is completely replaced by visceral, organic forms that suggest a turning away from the physical body to its interior workings, body organs, orifices, anatomical parts, fleshy, often highly eroticized. They are made not from materials traditionally associated with sculpture, but from, as I said, plaster, latex, wax. These are materials that are soft when you work with them and only harden later. They're often materials that are difficult to control. They're pliable but slippery and require a different set of skills. So she'd relearnt in a new language, a different touch, heating, pouring, wrapping, modelling, all handwork without the intervention of metal tools. And they're so different in form and material, but they still somehow do relate to architectural archetypes, but not entirely of the modern built environment. But if we just look at them, the layer, a little, possibly an organic shell form, but still a sense of sheltering something, but then fused with much more visceral, physical, womb-like forms. Amoeba on the right, suggesting something almost aquatic. And then works like this, Avenza, very bodily, Le Regard, bodily, an orifice, an opening, sexual connotations, but still connected with our idea of woman house, woman container. Many of these works are very emphatically gendered. Even when one begins to think about Avenza, are we talking about breast or penis? And then we look at a work like Fillet in this show, astonishingly brutal, shocking representation of the phallus, but when you look closely, if you dare look closely, it combines references to both male and female. And what we have now as a result of research and papers recently written, commenting on those writings of Bourgeois, is, as the art historian Mignon Nixon has very eloquently argued, that Bourgeois' period of psychoanalysis propelled her towards a shift in thinking about sculpture. By the 1960s, it was becoming more emotionally charged, more psychologically dense, and more corporeal, more bodily, dealing explicitly with themes of sexuality and the body as a way to externalize unconscious processes. The body of the site as the site of psychic process. And Mignon Nixon reads Bourgeois' works of the early 1930s as devoted to questions of subjectivity and emergence. So the indistinct forms, shadowy interiors, references to nests and layers, all evoke for her psychic states. And Bourgeois' use of the spiral, which you can see here, for example, this spiraling layer form, is in her view an indication of flux and loss of control, evidence of anxiety, the anxiety which emerged in early childhood, which persisted throughout her artist's life, but became recognized and understood during the course of the analysis. So psychoanalysis was for Bourgeois a process of uncompromising self-examination. She had always been interested in psychoanalytic literature and psychology. Her interest dates by many years, the actual psychoanalysis she took, and it continued to preoccupy her for the rest of her life. Last year, I was able to visit Louise Bourgeois' home, which still exists on West 20th Street and has hardly been touched. And I was allowed access to Louise Bourgeois' bedroom, and this is the very Louise Bourgeois-like door that you go through from the landing into her bedroom. And I had a few moments with her bookcases either side of her bed. So this is the stuff she would have read at night before sleeping, or read in the night during a frequent burst of insomnia. But these books are extraordinary. A biography of Freud, R.D. Laing's Knots, lots of books on child psychology, investigations of sex and love, methodologies of relaxation, alongside with a handful of really heavy French literary tomes. So highly literate, highly read, highly curious. And in psychoanalysis, I think Bourgeois went through an undoing of that memory to gain a deeper, more loaded and more traumatic and nuanced understanding of her childhood. And for those of you who don't know her biography, it was the nature of the relationship in her childhood. Here she is with a family at Choisy-le-Roi, a wealthy bourgeois French home surrounded by loving relations and family workers. But it was the nature of the relationship between her father and mother Henriette, father Louis, and her, and then her father's, the impact of the devastating affair that Louis had with Sadie, the English governess, who arrived to teach the children English but stayed as her father's lover. Her own position in the family as the clever, favoured daughter who should have been her son, her father's cruelty, his inappropriate, incestuous behaviour towards her, her mother's weakness as her mother became sick in middle age, and later on, her own relationships as an adult, shaped by those childhood experiences, her relationship with her near silent husband, Professor Goldwater, their difficult, traumatized adopted son, Michel, their birth children, Alain and Louis. And the writer and curator, Philip Larratt-Smith, not co-curator, but advisor, curatorial advisor on this show, has done so much recently to connect Louise's analysis and relate those writings to her work. And he describes one of the very powerful works in this exhibition, and I imagine some visitors find this room kind of difficult, the work hanging down Janus Fleury. He remarks on its clear references to breast, penis, and vagina as embodying what he calls the triadic structure of the Oedipal complex, mirroring the triadic structures, the triadic nuclear of Louise Bourgeois' family, mother, father, daughter, the love triangle of Sadie, Louis, Louise, connected in adulthood to triangles then formed with her sons, the three boys, and then with Robert, all of which, as I suggested earlier, are embedded in those towers of Tate Modern. But as the amazing feminist psychoanalyst Juliet Mitchell has explained, many of the revelations could only have come to Bourgeois through psychoanalysis. It is important, it's crucial. These were the return of the repressed, hitherto unconscious, and the work shifts from that abstraction of the kind of knowing to the figuration that came with true knowledge that she gained through psychoanalysis. It brought forth an extraordinary data bank of stories to tell. And the American critic Donald Cuthbert has argued that at the same time, psychoanalysis gave her the stories, but he gave her the strength to control her phobias, her obsessions, and her depression. She could simply not have gone on and had the career she had without that experience of controlling her phobias. So first hiatus with a breakdown in the 50s, no work, and then this extraordinary new energy. She was able to manage her traumas. It armed Louise Bourgeois, allowing her to return endlessly to this rich corpus of memories, and gave her permission, if you like, to treat her own experiences as valid subject matter. And over time, Bourgeois became more and more confident in exploring those traumas, and the work becomes increasingly explicit, almost literal over time, and in moving to the body and fragments of the body, and then to what we call part objects. Bourgeois was really, during the 70s and 80s, kind of ratcheting up the emotional and psychic weight of the work. And it's not difficult to understand, as I said, why so many viewers find this kind of work difficult. But what is the shape of the problem? I love this. She has some great T-shirt slogans. What is the shape of the problem? Transforming stories, personal stories, into art is never easy for an artist. I know this from talking with my students at EWA. How do you get the personal story into an image or into a form? That is the challenge. And I caution against over-reading Louise's work or seeing it as simply illustrative. And she herself was very clear about this. The work of art, she said, is limited to the acting out, not an understanding. And what she really meant, it's not just the story, it's how you present it, what you make of it. Art is a guarantee of sanity, but not a liberation. Trauma returns again and again. All work emerges crucially, not just from the inner workings of an artist's mind, but also from the art world of its time, and from an artist's expansive and ever-growing data bank of visual and cultural references. And I find this a very compelling avenue about what further research might take place in the work of Louise Bourgeois. And the art historian Anne Wagner, some years ago, connected Bourgeois' enigmatic cave-like inventions. And I'm just going to rush back to show you the work I mean. I'm returning, undoing, Le Regard, this work, extraordinary work on the right-hand side. But Anne connects that work to the artist's very memorable, we know memorable because she wrote about it in her diary, visit to the prehistoric caves of Lascaux in southern France in the 1950s. And there were many other artists who also had kind of revelatory experiences when they visited Lascaux, Giacometti among them. But you could also see her work, I think, through the lens of late biomorphism. Bourgeois described her first encounter with Joan Miro's work in the 1930s as a wonderful aesthetic shock. She loved Miro's work. And Miro became a friend visiting Bourgeois on his first visit to the USA and subsequently. And it's also remembering, when we think of Villette, that Bourgeois was not the first to make explicitly phallic work in a modernist guise. Bourgeois always held Giacometti in very high regard alongside Francis Bacon. Amongst the very few artists that she would mention with fondness and respect. But Giacometti's disagreeable object is surely what I would call a strong contender for a trigger object, not only for Villette, but as a precursor to the idea of the part object that became such a core of Bourgeois' practice. Another contender, of course, would be Brancusi, whose studio Bourgeois visited in the 1950s. I'm sharing with you a picture of an extraordinary work that Brancusi made in 1915, portrait of Marie Bonaparte, Princess X. Amazingly, Marie Bonaparte was a very renowned writer on psychoanalysis and somebody who elsewhere in Bourgeois' writings she writes with great interest in. So there is a very demonstrable connection between this. One can argue the case that this would have been a work that sat somehow in the database of images in Bourgeois' mind. Encountering her new work of the 1960s after a decade-long absence from the critic Daniel Robbins, remarked, it was as if an old acquaintance, once darkly lean, elegant and aloof, had come back from a journey transformed, fleshly, chalky, round and organic. The materials that Bourgeois was now using set her very firmly against the rising wave of minimalism in New York. When you think of Donald Judd, Sol LeWitt, they were the stars of the scene, and Bourgeois was going in the other direction. But there are ways in which actually her work was attuned to a kind of powerful, slightly under the radar, but alternative development in those years. I've always been interested in this little conversation that I see between Kusama and Bourgeois' work, one that has not really been explored, but it's very telling. There are a number of different, both the growing interest in performance, but also the use of the sort of breast phallus as a sort of almost a performative trope. Anyway, I'll explore it one of these days. But Lucy Lippard, the now legendary curator and art historian, but at that stage a very young curator, she was the one who noticed the emergence of what she called an against the grainness. She meant against the grain of minimalism in a number of very young emerging artists. And Lippard met Bourgeois quite by chance, I mean literally by chance, because Lippard's supervisor on her PhD was Robert Goldwater, Bourgeois' husband. So they just came across each other during a during a session of supervision. And Lippard recognized when she saw Bourgeois' work something of the same feeling in this much more senior artist. And she invited Louise to be included in an exhibition she was making in 1966 called Eccentric Abstraction. And this was almost Bourgeois' first return to the art world after this period of absence, and she chose to return as a much younger figure. It included the young Bruce Nauman, Keith Saunier, and Eva Hesse. And in selecting the show, Lippard was, she explained, looking for things that were both modular and had some minimal sense of structure and armature, but that broke with that armature, flopping out of it in a vaguely erotic way. So that sort of softness, informality, the eroticism of Bourgeois' work was absolutely on a par with what Lippard was looking for. A major work from this new decade of Bourgeois so that's the catalogue cover. A really signature work from this decade, 60s into 70s, and I think it's a real highlight of this exhibition. Represents for me the kind of apotheosis of this moment. And she had been invited to show at an alternative artist-run space. And I think Bourgeois, because of that, felt very liberated to do something out of the box. And this is a dark, kind of blood-red layer. I mean, anticipating the red rooms. But Bourgeois scattered animal and human organs, male and female, with theatrical drapes and strange breast-like mounds. And it's kind of like an extraordinary diorama from a natural history museum. It feels both physical and deeply psychological. And she described the destruction of the father in a very personal way. Their piece is basically a table, she said. The awful, terrifying family dinner table, headed by the father, who sits and gloats. And the others, the wife, their children, what can they do? They sit there in silence. The mother, of course, tries to satisfy the tyrant, her husband. The children are full of exasperation. We were the 3 children, my brother, my sister, and myself. My father would get nervous looking at us and would explain to us all what a great man he was. So in exasperation, we grabbed the man, we threw him on the table, we dismembered him, we proceeded to devour him. So this vision of eating the father, fabulous, incredible. In 1982, a young curator at MoMA, Deborah Y., managed to persuade the museum's leadership to give Louise Bourgeois a retrospective, the first ever given by the museum to a young woman. Sorry, a woman artist, not a young woman, quite a senior woman by this stage. But visitors to that exhibition would have seen an extraordinary range of work in a dazzling array of materials from an already long career. And the exhibition included extraordinary work representing the 1970s. And, you know, Louise Bourgeois at that moment, at the dawn of the 80s, was seemingly a radical feminist, experimenting with performance for the first time. But she was also, this is an image from her Brooklyn studio that she moved into about the year of that retrospective, a very mature sculptor. And she had transformed over the last decade those soft, mutable, visceral vocabulary of the 1960s by casting it in bronze and wax and mastering the art of marble, working with skilled Italian craftsmen on many visits to Italy, where she worked alongside and in likely competition with the great British artist Henry Moore. And Bourgeois made very notable work in marble, pitting herself, in my view, against history. I can see that she wanted to take on the male domain. She wanted to work against the grain of the greats. And these works, you can begin to see them here with the very sharply polished marble coming out of a sort of very rough base of unworked marble. It's the history of marble sculpture from the Roman times via the Renaissance right up to Roda. This was an area she was reluctant to comment on in that interview. It was when I asked about Roda that she said, no, 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 no. But she's not here to say no any longer, and I still think my question stands. Bourgeois' interest in addressing her life story, meanwhile, was still inexhaustible and expressed in her work and shared at length in public interviews. This is really the moment she came out in a slideshow of very evocative black and white photographs, subsequently published in Art Forum, so total international circulation. She spelt out that life story, a seemingly idyllic life, a tightly knit family, pulled apart by the affair of the father with the English governess. And nowhere is the autobiographic and psychic charge more obvious than in those cell works, like the Red Room, that Bourgeois made from the 1980s, through the 1990s and on into her last decade. And they can and should be seen as continuous meditations on memory, interior spaces that make evident the continuity of the past in the artist's present, and her necessity in confronting and reconfronting the experience. And you can, and commentators do, read the details in these works in very literal ways. And Bourgeois has been extremely generous and explicit in setting out the meaning of the images. So this is an amazing work from 1997, Passage Dangereux. It's a kind of multiple conjoined cell. But in this work, the chairs hanging down on the right-hand side, over there, very explicitly represent for Louise Bourgeois, literally, the attic at her childhood home, where her father, who was a furniture restorer, hung up the antique chairs, the sièges de bois, waiting to be reupholstered. And the prosthetic leg brace hanging here from the ceiling represents her sister, Henriette, who suffered from a chronic leg injury. And there's a work in this exhibition, Couple 4, great work, great dark coupling, in headless couple coupling, and the woman has a prosthetic leg. And that likely, more than likely, does refer to the fact that her sister could not have children, and this was a tragedy. We know also from Louise that there are needles everywhere in the work, particularly from this period when she starts making work with fabric. They do not signify pain, absolutely not, but the notion of restoration, epitomized by her mother's endless efforts at conservation and repair in her tapestry repair business. And Louise's own early entry into art was, interestingly, as an assistant to her mother, as quite a small child. Her precocious facility in drawing, lending itself to the business, designing decorative flourishes and floral elements to replace imagery too explicit in tapestries for the American market. So her mother would cut out pictures of the genitalia of little cupids, and Louise Bourgeois would design flowers and leaves to go on top of them. And there's a very nice reference to that in one of these late cells. You can see the tapestry inside here, and you can just see here a piece of tapestry where the genitalia of this figure has been cut away for Louise to repair with a nicer image. But all this, of course, is fascinating and very interesting from a diagnostic point of view, but in some ways it's also detail. Just as significant, I think, more important, arguably, for our engagement with the work than this literal and personal iconography is the dynamic spatial formula and material substance that Bourgeois evolved for this exploration of body and environment, self and past self. And that sense of play to and for the audience was already in place with that precocious interest in installation in the 1950s. But as she approached her own 80s and 90s, Bourgeois was likely very well aware of a new generation of artists making work, expanding from the wall, coming down from the plinth and the pedestal into the theatrical space of the gallery, into the landscape and into the environment. And the cells were Bourgeois' contribution to this new art of installation. Like a lot of work from that period, they were made from salvaged building materials, evocative principally of hospital or prison cells, lots of strong resonance, and replete with symbols and associative items of furniture and sculpture. So they all play, even without the very personal narrative of the kind of interconnection of physical and psychological sensations. And although profoundly distant, they resonate for me with the kind of caged works by Alberto Giacometti and even Francis Bacon's caged paintings, as I said, two of the very few artists that Bourgeois respected and regarded almost as mentors. And for both those artists, Giacometti and Bacon, used compression as a technique to amplify already powerful emotions. And you see a very similar methodology working in Bourgeois over time. These are some of her very late cells, which she made for the first time using the human head. And I don't know the answer to why she introduced the human head. It's certainly something to think about. There's some connection between her methodologies and very strong exemplars that she was aware of and work she responded to. Bourgeois explained that her concern was with pain. The cells she wrote represent different types of pain, the physical, the emotional, and the psychological, the mental and the intellectual. And I just want to speak for a few words and come back to I do, I redo, undo, I redo, the Tate work, because it was ultimately and undoubtedly the apotheosis of the cells. And the towers were the end point of this very long journey. Alongside the towers and their roots in the 40s, amongst her very earliest drawings is an extraordinary, slightly awkward little drawing of a spider. It's in the vitrine in this exhibition. It's an image of a spider from 1947, and that was a theme that lay dormant for years and years and years and only recurred in the 1990s in a little sculpture and in a text work called Ode to My Mother, where Louise wrote about the spider is an ode to my mother. She was my best friend. Like a spider, my mother was a weaver. Like spiders, my mother was clever. Spiders are friendly presences. They eat mosquitoes. Spiders are helpful and protective, just like my mother. So Maman, which Louise made in the first instance for Tate Modern, and which is now hosted here, looking absolutely incredible in the natural environment, was made for Tate Modern to stand over and protect her children, the three towers. She was not the last, but it was undoubtedly the mother of all her spiders. 9 meters tall, she towers above all other iterations, nesting in her mesh-like sac, a cluster of marble eggs, both fertile and protective, and vulnerable too. She's the great mother figure for whom giving birth is inseparable from death, a sort of metaphor for the great cycle of life from birth to the afterlife, the doing, the undoing, and the redoing. And commentators have consistently seen Maman through a Freudian lens. The child's first and most powerful love object, a symbol of infantile dependence, representing the ambivalent emotions children feel towards their parents. The good mother, bad mother split that Freud explored is presented, I need not say it again, across so much of Bourgeois' work, and is connected to primal anxieties around dependency, the fear of annihilation or castration, that sense that the self might be overwhelmed or consumed by a larger and more powerful other. The marble eggs could be read as symbolic of fertility. Freud often tied maternal figures to the origins of their desire, but also to its repression. The mother is the source of both pleasure and prohibition. But this ambivalent psychic charge is not the only framework, and I think you see that particularly when you see Maman installed in context outside the North America, outside the New York, with its obsession with psychoanalysis. Images of spinning, sewing, and weaving, and the spiral abound in Louise's work again and again, as we saw earlier. You can see the spider as a weaver, a mother, but also maybe as fate itself. Relevant figures connected to creativity and craft and the shaping of destiny have much, much longer roots than Freudian theory. From the story of Ariadne in Greek mythology, Ariadne, the daughter of Idmonius of Colophon, who discovered the art of dyeing and weaving cloth, as well as making of nets and snares and traps for catching small creatures. And if you cast your net beyond Europe, you find Anansi, the spider in West African and Caribbean tradition, a clever trickster figure, a spinner of stories. And amongst indigenous American mythologies, the spider woman as the weaver of the world itself, a creator figure. And spiders likewise feature hugely in fairy tales and the Gothic imagination, as well as in classic horror literature. And weavers abound in children's stories over centuries. For me, Maman is also Homer's Penelope, a famous weaver, a faithful wife, in her lonely task of unmaking as she waited Odysseus' return. an endless Sisyphean cycle of labour that mimics repetitive recycling and bridges the past, present, and future of the great towers. I do, I undo, and redo. So what we learn, or what I have learnt in my afterlife, I suppose, with Bourgeois' art, is that diligence and repetition can spawn immense creativity. And just as the spider spins and weaves its thread, so too all of Bourgeois' work unravels and is rewoven in a rich and powerful and diverse narrative. And the diversity, if not in the stories, is in the material and the form, the making and the narrating, as the artist moves from figurative to abstract, formal to informal, and from discrete objects to the space of experience. But it is finally a narrative that sweeps us along and allows us to bring our own narratives and our own symbols and our own associations on a spiraling journey through time, hers, but actually ours, past to present, and through encounters with the artist's most intimate experiences to our personal reflections on our own lifetime's adventures. So together with Louise, we do, we undo, and we redo. Thank you.